Here we come, walking down the street. We get the funniest looks from everyone we meet. Hey, hey, we're the monkeys, and people say we monkey around, but we're too busy singing.
All right, folks, welcome to Talking the Talk with Don. Today, we're heading back to the days of girls wearing their hair on the sides of their heads, boys with bowl cuts, members-only jackets, and hyper-color t-shirts. The days of waiting for your favorite song to come on the radio so you could record it on cassette, remembering when it was a huge deal to have more than one television in the house. That was a big one. But my guest today is Rebecca Markus, who has an awesome TikTok account and podcast called TV Tangents, where she revisits the Generation X television shows of old. Some of them I remember vividly, even if they only ran for one season. And it's so much fun to watch her talk about these things on TikTok. And I'm very happy to have Rebecca on Talking the Talk. So, Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you, Don, for having me. I'm excited to be here. Talk about my absolute favorite thing in the whole world.
I know it's so, and it's so funny because I don't know if you feel the same way, but being that Generation X is even a thing, like, I don't know that I was even aware that we were a whole generational culture of our own until it started to get pointed out to us
Mhm.
by people, especially younger people. Was it kind of the same way for you?
Absolutely, because Gen Xers don't like being labeled, and we don't understand the other generation's obsessions with labels. Our boomer parents were trying to escape the rigid society and the labels and everything, and they pass that on to us. And then our kids come along and want to label absolutely everything, which is a conversation I have with my kids all the time. I have teenagers, and I always say, I don't know why you guys want to label everything. Just, we hated labels, absolutely hated them.
Yeah, we totally did. And I just remember, like, and even if there were labels, they were so limited. Like, I remember, there were the prep kids, and then there were the jocks, and then they were like I don't know, they didn't even call everyone burnouts or anything because not all of us were, but you had the long-haired hard rock metal guys like myself, but the labels, and even then, like, you didn't really adhere to a specific label. You just were who you were.
And you didn't dare give yourself a label. You didn't say, I'm a prep, you know. But now the kids are like, well, I'm this and I'm this and I'm not. And I'm like, just be. I don't know. Just be.
Oh yeah. I mean, and that was the thing is like, especially like my friends and I, we were metalheads, but headbangers or whatever you wanted to call it. But like even back then, it's like you didn't even really have to identify yourself because people just kind of knew who if you saw guys in long hair and denim jackets with Motorhead buttons and patches all over. You kind of assumed that they were into metal, or if you saw the guy who was in like the Esprit shirt or whatever, you were like, okay, I know what you're into. I don't need to be told.
Exactly. I can tell you in my school we called them Hessians, the long hairs with the black t-shirts. Did you guys use that term?
I think they were called heshers, is what I read.
Yeah, I think it's very regional.
It is because you're from like are you from the north?
I'm in middle America.
Oh, you're in the middle.
I'm
Okay,
dead
yes.
center. Yeah.
So yeah, so I grew up in New Orleans and Atlanta as a kid and going into high school, and I do feel like it was a very generational thing because I do know in California, my sister-in-law told me they used to call them burnouts
Hmm.
because so many of them were into like smoking weed and stuff, whereas
Yeah.
like I think growing up in the Southeast, it wasn't as prevalent to smoke weed and that stuff as a
Mhm.
teenager. I mean, I know a lot of us did, but most of us being from the Nancy Reagan era, like
Yeah, don't do drugs. Just say no.
I can't believe that any of us got laid and that any of us ever did anything after we grew up because like we were pretty much being like groomed to be nuns and priests, which was
Yeah.
insane to me.
Hey, those anti-drug commercials worked on me 100%. I don't know if you remember the one. It was just the lower part of a person's face,
Hmm.
and they were sniffing up cocaine, and these little objects would fly by under their nose, like their house, and they'd sniff it up, and their car goes under, and they sniff it up. And they said, if you think that doing drugs, you won't have anything to worry about, you're right. If you do drugs, you won't have anything to worry about. And I vividly remember this. And I thought, okay, I'm not doing drugs because I won't have any money to buy a car and I won't have anything to worry about. Something along those lines, but totally worked on me.
That was so fun. And then like the things that they would show us in school would peel paint off of the walls these days. Cause I remember watching like one of those, when they would wheel the TV in on the cart with the
Mhm.
VCR and everything, which was you were psyched when
Love
that
it.
came
Yep.
in. And we watched this show on like just people, drug use. And there was a guy who had done so much cocaine he could pull like I don't remember if it
Nice.
was a string through his nose or something. And then they showed some other kid getting his stomach pumped, and we were just like, "What the fuck is happening?" Like,
Radical.
oh my God, I am not gonna ever do that stuff, and then of course, unfortunately, then the AIDS epidemic comes in, and then it's sex will kill you, drugs are going to kill you, don't drink. And it was such a weird time to grow up. Like, how did we make it out of that? Seriously.
Did we? I mean, we have a lot of excuses for our mental health. I remember we had a guy come to our school to talk about drugs, and he told us all about when he used to do LSD and all these drugs. And his whole presentation was so fascinating. And I was like, that sounds really cool. How do I get into this? But I'd already seen the commercials that told me not to. But like, yeah, they weren't doing us any favors with that one.
I remember watching one of those. What was it? It was like an after school special or something. And it was these kids that were like smoking weed in like a basement, and they were all listening to like rock music and stuff. And I'm like, that looks kind of fun.
That looks
Like,
fun. Yeah. Yeah.
until one of them ended up in the hospital because he took LSD and then jumped off a bridge. And I'm like, okay. I'm like,
Yes.
maybe this is not where I want to go with this.
Yeah. The jumping out of windows things, that's why I'm not doing any LSD to this day. But we really were traumatized.
And people wonder where like the mental health aspect of our generation comes in. It's like, I mean, not only were we just like scarred to death by stuff like that, I mean, we were afraid of the world, but at the same time, like our parents didn't give a rat's ass where we were at any point in the day. Do you know what I
It's
mean?
true. That's true. That's true. Now I've seen a lot of Gen Xers on TikTok talk about, the latchkey generation and our parents don't know where we were, but I had a different experience. I grew up in a small city in the inner city, and my family was the Keatons from Family Ties, like to the T. My parents were ex-hippies. I have an older brother who was born Alex Keaton. He's currently he's in politics. And then just for fun, later on when I was 7, my parents, to thicken the plot, had another baby because once the older kids start to get older, you've got to replace them with another kid for ratings. So I have a little brother who turns 43 today, and we were like just a happy-go-lucky nuclear family. And so I didn't have all that Gen X trauma. I came home and my mom was home, and I watched the Brady Bunch and had snacks.
Hmm.
And we had one TV. So I wasn't watching stuff I wasn't supposed to be watching. And
Right.
my parents knew where I was all the time because they were always around. So I don't
It's
share that aspect of Gen X.
was what it was. Like our parents worked, like my mom worked, my dad worked.
Hmm.
My
Yeah.
my mom worked during the day and got home at 3 o'clock, which meant she had an hour to herself before she had to start getting dinner ready. My dad worked in retail, so he was working crazy hours, until 9, 10 at night. And when, when we wanted to go outside, it was like, all right, dinner's at 5. When I do talk to a lot of Gen X people, especially like our ages who did have these life experiences, they were like, you know, we never felt unloved or like completely neglected and everything. But then if you put this down on paper and then you look back on it, it's like your parents hated you and didn't care if you got kidnapped or died,
Right,
but it
right.
was like, I don't know, it just was what it was. And
So I really had two sides of it because my mom, she's a stay-at-home mom, and we were basically free ranged when my dad wasn't home. My dad was afraid of absolutely everything happening to us getting kidnapped, us getting pregnant, us doing drugs, whatever. That he just wanted to keep us inside. So he didn't know that my mom was just letting us run around the neighborhood all day when he wasn't home. Be back before dad gets home. So he doesn't know that you were out all day sneaking into the football stadium and getting chased by the cops. But that's what we did. So I had two polar opposite parents.
it's just so interesting because the scenarios that we grew up in ended up becoming such a stereotype for many years later in television shows and movies, getting caught smoking on the playground during after school hours, or sneaking into a gym, or I don't know, rolling someone's house, like egging someone's, like this was the crap we did that was fun. It's like,
As long as my parents didn't find out, I didn't care what trouble I got into with whoever, as long as my parents don't find out, it's all good.
but why did we do the shit anyway? Because we knew, like,
We had nothing else to do.
it was like the adventure of getting caught for some reason. But you're right. I mean, what were you gonna do on a Saturday?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you got up and you ate cereal and you watched cartoons, but then, like, we didn't have internet or games or any of this shit, and it was either hang out with your parents or your mom all day, or like get on your bike and go out. And I was like the least physically fit kid of my generation probably, but I still, like, I had a bike and I rode
Mhm.
it everywhere,
Yeah.
just
Well, in the summertime, my mom would lock us out of the house because she was cleaning the house. So she would lock the door and we weren't allowed to come in unless we had to go to the bathroom. And even then, she'd say, "Don't your friends have bathrooms? Go use one of theirs." And if you needed to go inside, you had like 1 minute and then she'd throw you back out again.
Oh yeah, and then there was always like I couldn't even imagine, like, thinking back now, is that when you would go over to a friend's house, like you'd be out like that during the day, then you'd show up and your friend's mom would answer the door. There'd be four of us standing out on the and going, "Can we use the bathroom? Is it so and so?" And you would just be like, "Okay." And like when you look at these things now, you're like, they would call the cops if four kids showed up on their doorstep asking to use the bathroom.
Right?
You
What
know,
is this?
especially if none of them were your kids, because that was another thing too,
Just random
Yeah,
children. Yeah.
you know.
It was a wild time.
Well, so I had to ask you, so when you started doing this TikTok, what was it that what was the catalyst of it for you?
So the TikTok was an offshoot of my podcast, TV Tangents, where we talk about only 20th century television. And it started out as just like supplemental videos of things that were related to what we were talking about at that time. So just short clips. And then one day I looked and we had 20,000 followers, and TikTok was like, "Hey, if you make long videos, we'll pay you for them." And I said, "Okay." So I started making mini podcasts, basically,
Hmm.
just a mini version of our podcast about things that are super interesting to me because, like I said, absolutely nobody else is going to listen to me talk about this.
Hmm.
So I'm going to talk to the TikTokers who want to listen. And I have all these random facts in my head that just need to get out. So the podcast TV Tangents is my best friend and I. we had always said we need a show because our friends would tell us you need a show. You talk incessantly about things and you're super funny. So
Hmm.
when I discovered podcasting, we're like, this is what we're going to do. So it's really just conversations that we would normally be having. But now hopefully somebody's listening to us because our friends got tired of listening to us. And we don't have a lot of listeners, we don't have a lot of followers, and we're not consistent with, posting the show, but it's a mental health break for both of us. My co-host Natalie owns a business, and so this is her creative outlet, de-stressor at the end of a stressful week, and that's why we keep doing it.
I love that because at least for at least for me, growing up alongside, I feel like we grew up alongside technology. Like we're in this weird, like this weird space of time where like we were, you know, we're old enough to remember life long before the internet and cell phones, but at the same time, we're at this age now where we can't imagine not having the internet and cell phones. And so like just growing up alongside that technology. And I
Hmm.
think that when podcasts and things like that started to become pretty prevalent, it was the same thing like with me. My friends would say stuff like, you have like the absolute most useless information about bands and music, and they were like, and you always talk about how you'd like to talk to these bands or whatever. They're like, why don't you just do it? At least
Hmm.
try it and see. And I don't have a ton of listeners. I mean, I've got a pretty decent following, but I get to talk to people that I grew up idolizing, and it is this outlet for me because then all of a sudden I'm not a 51-year-old house husband with ADHD and riddled with anxiety. It's like all of a sudden I get to be like 18 years old talking to like one of my heroes and asking all the questions that I ever wanted to ask.
It's amazing.
And it's fun, right? Because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, we're doing it because it's fun for us. It gives us something to do.
And occasionally we get an email or a message from someone raving about our show or something we talked about. And just to have that one person who appreciates us is worth the last however many years we've been doing this. Even if just one person's listening, it makes it worth it. And I'm going to keep talking about TV. So never going to stop.
And I hope you don't, because it was like you just ended up on my For You page at some point, because I do follow a lot of you know, old, older people our age, posting old music videos and things like this. And when your account came across, I was laughing so hard because I can't remember what show you were talking about, but it was so funny that I just ended up in a rabbit hole just watching all your videos. And I was like,
Thank you.
I want to talk to this person. And the thing that solidified it for me to really want to talk to you is when you had an episode, you had a video one, it's the episode, how you like that? Total
Ah.
Generation X, everything's an episode. Was that you were talking about how you were in the car with your kids, and one of them said something about, when did Tesla get a new logo?
Yes.
And you said, that's Tesla the band, not the
Yes.
car. And I was like, that is amazing.
Yep. I try to educate my kids. And, my husband, being a musician, educates them on old music. And it was the same with my parents. My parents educated me on their music and their shows. And so that's another way that Gen X is unique, is that we started watching television from the beginning, from like I Love Lucy and those kinds of things, and went all the way through the shows that were made for us because
Mhm.
our parents shared their stuff with us. And I learned music listening to my dad's records, and I learned movies watching my mom and dad's shows. And so I think I'm doing that for my kids, but they have such a wider range of things to discover than I ever did.
It's like such an oversaturated world right now because with all the streaming services and all of the, I don't know, like the Spotify and all this. I mean, in some ways, as kids, we would have loved this, but at the same time, this is probably a reason why we can remember some of the TV shows that we watched because we didn't have a gajillion options. You had what, 7 channels maybe? Like at the most, you had the network channels and then you had the UHF channels. It's like you had to turn the bottom knob to get, and
The rabbit ear channels, yeah.
oh my gosh. And so it's just really interesting to me that I don't think that younger generations always understand why a lot of this stuff stays with us because
Right.
we didn't have so much that we couldn't keep up with. But and it's so funny because one of the things I wanted to ask you about or talk to you about was I was doing some research for this and going through some old TV shows. I found a couple of great websites that had like TV listings from you know the 80s to the 90s and was listing all the TV shows and reoccurring themes seems to be such a big thing. And even to now, so many of the themes of a lot of shows are reoccurring themes from the 80s. Like,
Hmm.
who the hell needed 7 or 10 PI shows or
I
like
did.
or 8 hospital shows? I was just gonna say I wanted them because
I
I
did.
loved every one of them for like their own different reasons. And so when you think about some of these shows, like if you hear a show name, can you vividly see the intro, the characters, and all that stuff?
Absolutely. I will picture some episode that stuck with me. I'll picture the beginning, the intro, I'll hear the theme song. Speaking on themes, one of my earliest obsessions when I was a little girl, I was obsessed with TV shows about cars. I was obsessed with Knight Rider and Speed Buggy and Dukes of Hazzard. And my dad drove a 72 Barracuda, which he still owns.
No.
And yes, and I would ask him to put me in the car Dukes of Hazzard style. So he would, oh my God.
Go through the window.
So he would roll down the window and put me in. When I was like 5 years old, he'd put me in the car, Dukes of Hazzard style. I was obsessed with cars as a kid. And that was the theme in the early 80s. There was a big theme around cars.
Oh my gosh. And I can't tell you how many times I got yelled at for trying to run and slide across the hood
Yes.
of my parents' car. My dad would be like, "What are you doing? You're
He would have
scratching
had
the
a heart
car
attack.
up." So, but that is so car shows. That's an interesting topic. Like, so what were some? Well, we talked about Speed Buggy and Night Rider. I feel like Night Rider was like the big one.
It was. And most people I talk to don't remember Speed Buggy. It was a cartoon about a dune buggy with eyeballs, and they would ride around on a beach. I don't remember a lot about it. I was just completely obsessed with it.
Do you ever that Speed Buggy? This was like a total stoner revelation, by the way, like when I was like in my early 20s, was that Speed Buggy was actually Scooby-Doo with a car instead of a dog.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Like the same number of characters, the same kind of thing. And then I was like, oh my God, so many of those shows recycled like those like changed themes, but then would give you like a different character or something.
Yes. So we've been doing our podcast for a long time, since 2018. And one of the things we do to prepare is we binge a show, whether we've seen the show or not. We just watch all the episodes that we can. And if you listen long term to our podcast, you'll hear us repeating the themes and, oh, this happened in this show, and this happened in this show. And a lot of just basic storylines are regurgitated in all of these shows. Um, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but we frequently relate one show to another, and it just crosses genres. Like you said, all of the PI shows, they've all got a lot of the same basic premise, and a lot of the family sitcoms, the same things happen. And there's always a formula to all of these episodes as well. So we've noticed these patterns more now that we're binging the shows that we watched when we were kids.
So for your podcast, and I have listened to this before. I forgot what show it was I was listening to because I'm like, hell, a Generation X brain. I was like, I can't remember. Um, when you go back and watch some of these shows, what are some of the shows that you have watched that you're like, I thought this was so much better, like when I was younger, and like now you're watching it and you're like, oh, what's going on here?
Yeah, so one of my favorites when I was a kid was Greatest American Hero. Part of that was because it had the best TV theme song ever.
It's incredible.
Um, and I watched the first episode, which is like movie length. It was a TV movie. And then I told my co-host, you have to watch Greatest American Hero because I remember how excellent it was. It was amazing. And the first episode was amazing. And so we both got to watching it. It's not all that. It's not. It has some wild special effects. The storylines are weird. The aliens look weird. Um, but we were watching it with very little context in the 80s on these little tiny screens.
Uh-huh.
And now we're watching it with a, 21st century lens.
Yeah.
And it's a completely different experience.
And it's interesting because that's the other thing is that the storylines for a lot of these shows, I feel like stuck with me, whether or not now I think they're very, but like it was like, I wish I could have been in the writer's room when they were coming up with the concept of the greatest American hero, where they were like, okay, so this guy finds this suit, but then he loses the instructions on how to use the suit. And and he can't fly well. He flies into everything. And I'm just going like if you showed that to like a 13-year-old now, they would just be like, what this is dumb. What is this? But like we were like all into it. So what are some other ones that you because you know what actually I remembered the show you were talking V
Ah,
because we're talking about V. And the one that made me laugh the most was because I still remember the big cliffhanger was the woman who was giving birth to the kids. And she had the one normal kid, and then the other one came out. And it was like a full-on lizard. It was like,
that scene terrified me as a child. It was terrifying. And I watched that. I don't remember what year V came out. I feel like it was like 84 or 85.
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And so I would have been like 10 years old,
Hmm.
9 or 10. And I watched this whole series with my family, and I was freaked out all the time. Like they were peeling their skin off, they were taking their eyeballs out, they were eating rats.
I forgot about the eating the rats.
Oh, that was fabulous. Fabulous.
And it was like a Sunday night show, right? I think it was a, or
It
what
it
is,
was it was prime time. I'm not sure what night it was, but yeah, it was prime time.
I mean, because I remember watching it with my mom and dad, and like my kid brother who was 3.5 years younger than me, and I'm
Hmm.
like, and we thought that they thought that was okay for us to.
And Gen X, we watched everything with our families. You
Hmm.
had prime time, everybody would sit around and watch whatever block you chose for that day. And my kids don't do, I mean, we used to watch shows with the kids, but now they each have their own device and they do whatever. If they don't want to watch what's on the main TV, they just go in another room with their iPad and pull up whatever they want. And that's why in the podcast, we stick to the 20th century shows because there's a cutoff in the early 21st century where you can suddenly access everything you want. And so people are no longer standing around the water cooler talking about Cheers last night. Instead, you say, do you watch this show? Oh, no, I've never heard of that show. Or do you watch this show? Well, yeah, but I'm only on like the middle of season one. So don't tell me what happened. It's a completely different conversation. So we just didn't want to get into that territory where we're talking about more obscure shows that maybe not everybody's watching because in the 80s and 90s, everybody's watching almost the same thing.
I think looking back on some of these shows when I was doing some research on these, there were shows that ran for a good bit that I kind of forgot about. But then the minute I saw the name, I was like, oh my God, I remember watching this show. But then there were so many of these shows that ran 8 episodes and then disappeared. Some of them were just pilots and never. So, like, what were some of your favorite short run
So
shows?
in the 90s, I was the kiss of death for TV shows. I had a black and white TV in my bedroom. It was the only other TV in our house. And every time I found a new show that I loved, it would get canceled. I loved Parker Lewis Can't Lose. That was the answer to Ferris Bueller, because there was a Ferris Bueller show at the time. They ran about the same time, and they both got canceled very quickly. But I loved Parker Lewis Can't Lose. It got canceled. There was a show called P.S. I Love You that starred Greg Evigan. Do you remember Greg Evigan?
Oh my
From
God,
My Two Dads.
I do remember that show. Oh my
And
gosh,
Connie
yeah.
Selica was, they were private investigators who had to pretend like they were married and they lived in Palm Springs. God, I loved that show. And it got canceled. Just everything. And of course, I loved Freaks and Geeks, and that got canceled.
You're listing some now that I'm like, I didn't even think about them until you just called them off.
You know, I don't know. There was I recently on TikTok talked about Herman's Head, and that was one that I really liked. But it did last 4 seasons, but I still feel like it was prematurely canceled and it didn't have a big audience. It was about his subconscious and these his different parts of his personality. It was a great show.
See, and that's so interesting because looking back on a lot of those shows also now, it's amazing how some of the themes really still hold up, but we've also seen some of them kind of repeated, which is kind of nice because I feel like the whole Generation X joke now is like when you hear something, like I don't know, like I remember the first time I heard Greta Van Fleet, that the band, and I remember going, "Oh, I liked them better when they were called Led Zeppelin," because you know what I mean? Like we could say that, or I liked that show better when it was Magnum PI, or whatever.
Absolutely. There's a recent show on streaming. I don't know what service it's on. It's called Dr. Odyssey, and it stars Don Johnson. It's basically The Love Boat, with Don Johnson as the captain. I'm obsessed with it.
I watched that because of you.
It is so good. It's The Love Boat. And my husband, he never liked sitcoms. I don't know what his deal is. He never liked sitcoms, and so he hates that show. He's like, "This is so cheesy and corny." Yeah, it is, but that's what we want because we like cheesy and corny. We like happy storylines that everything ends up nicely, all tied up in a bow. And, it's a half an hour and we go on to the next thing. And that's what this is emulating, that type of television. And I think it's great.
The other thing I used to remember about these TV shows, now that I think about it, is that, even though there might be a theme
Mhm.
through through the show or whatever, there were so many of these shows that you could come in on like the fifth season, or fifth episode of season two, having never watched it, and like you weren't lost
Mhm.
because the only thing that sometimes seemed to be the recurring theme was the characters, and the
Mhm.
story was always different, and I appreciated that because again, generation ADHD. I did not have the capacity, and I still don't, to watch a show where I'm like, okay, if I miss an episode, I have to go back or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, Knight Rider. It was just like, what was it? Knight Rider, Magnum PI. I'm trying to think of the other one that I loved because I made a little list here. Hardcastle and McCormick. Yeah, do you remember that one?
I do. I didn't watch it, but I remember it.
Oh my God, you should put that on your list.
Okay. If we can find it.
What was it? It was a I want to say I think it was like a car thief who was on probation or something, and as part of his probation deal, he had to live with the judge, and
Mhm.
they like busted criminals together. It was like such a weird thing, but I was like, but again, I couldn't tell you a single
Right.
premise of an
Right.
episode, but I remember what the actual theme was. And I can see the people in it, and it's just
Well,
amazing.
the 70s and 80s had a billion shows, people fighting crime or solving mysteries. And what combination can we put in a show for solving crime? Okay, we have this old woman who's an author, and we have this curmudgeonly detective, and we have these two people who are forced to live together. That was the 70s and 80s. It was wonderful.
To kind of go back to what we were talking about, when I was kind of compiling a list of these shows, I was looking at themes, and it was cop shows, PI shows, medical shows, and then you had the kind of fringe shows that were like adventure, historical, sometimes almost educational. And one of the shows I was reminded of was The Voyagers. Do you remember that?
I did not watch that.
That was one of those type of shows where I feel like our teachers encouraged us to watch it because it was
Um,
like these two guys. This guy was a time traveler, and he had this little, like, kind of like a middle school
okay.
friend,
Yes, I know
and
which
they
one you're talking about.
traveled to all these historical moments, and then they had to fix things. And then all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, that was Quantum Leap later.
Yep. 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 Quantum Leap has, I mean, that's been all over the place. So many Quantum Leap shows. Like that, just that genre of like, we need to fix something in the past, or, let's go educate ourselves about. And now there's one on streaming. Oh my gosh, I can't remember the name of it, but Lisa Kudrow is in it. And oh, the hell is the name of that show?
I know because I saw that come up and I was like, oh my God, that kind of reminds me of the Quantum Leap kind of thing.
It is very Quantum Leap, and I can't remember the name of it. But yeah, they're time travelers, and there's a lot of history education in that show. And I've been trying to get my kids to watch it, but they refuse. And that's a really good one.
It's like your kids refuse to be educated. I've gone to school. I don't want to learn anything else.
Look, I don't know. I don't know anything. I don't know. I don't know pop culture. I don't know, computers. I don't know anything because I'm a grown up and they're kids. I am so cringe, let me tell you.
I can't even. So, like, we don't, like I said, my wife and I, we don't have children, but her niece and nephews, um, we started dating when her niece was 1, and now she's 28, and we've been together 27 years, and I still remember, like, meeting up with them for Christmases and stuff, and trying to tell them about things, and they were like, it must have been so terrible to be a kid then. And I was like, we didn't have anything else to really go off of because it was far cooler than what our parents were as kids, you know?
Yeah,
Like,
we didn't know that this all was going to happen, that you all were going to have whatever you wanted at your fingertips. We didn't know.
so let me ask you this. So let me ask you this with the TikTok thing. Have you run into any of the, oh great, now the old people are coming in and taking over our young platform? Have you heard that much at all, or
Only from my children. They get very upset. They they say, "Ew, you're on TikTok." Oh my God. And my husband and I, because we are old people and next week is our 24th anniversary, we sit on the couch every night and share our TikToks. We don't send them to each other, we show them to each other on our
that's
phones.
that's what we do.
My kids die over this. It is the worst thing that's ever happened to them. And if they are anywhere near us, they run away. They're like, oh my God, you guys, what are you doing? This is so cringe.
I'm in tears right now. That is so funny.
My daughter last night, she said, so you guys are going to sit here for an hour and play your TikToks at top volume so I can't do anything? I said, yes.
Go to your room.
Go to your room.
You have a room to go to. Go to it. That's so funny because I was just thinking about that because we started watching TikTok during the pandemic when we were
Yes.
in lockdown, and of course, because my wife is very introverted and I'm selectively extroverted, but I'm more than happy to just hang out at home and do nothing. And we would do that. We would watch TikToks together, and then we started saving TikToks throughout the day. And at the end of the day, we were like, "Oh, I got some TikToks for you," and then we would sit and just watch them. And I'm just thinking, like, that was so. And one of them was my wife, and it was literally, and I wish I would have saved it because it was a little while ago, but it was a girl crying, like legit crying, and she was like, "I just don't understand. Like, I got on TikTok, and this is my account, but then my mom got one, and she's got like way more followers than me, and it's not fair. The old people take everything away from us." And I just remember going, "That is amazing. I'm gonna follow your mom now." Like,
Absolutely love it. I love it because you know what? They threaten us. They're like, look, if you guys are here now, we don't want to be here anymore. And we're like, good. Do you think that anyone in Gen X is going to be sad that you guys are leaving? It's ours now. We own it now. Go away.
it's like, look, we've worked all our life to not be around kids. Like, and even us who did have kids, like we were like,
Right.
grow up fast, please, just
Right.
go.
Take your iPad and go. That's what I got it for.
Take your iPad and go. The TV shows that are out now, like, do you feel like some of them have the staying power, the lasting power that kids will remember these shows 20, 30, 40 years from now, the way that we remember the shows that we had?
I don't know that they will so much, and it's because of that. It's not a community factor that, when we were kids, you watched one of three channels for prime time and then you talked about it at school. And they might watch what their friends are watching and talk about it, but there's just such an saturation. What is that a word? It's
I,
oversaturated.
I'll, I'll let it slide because
Okay.
I fucking make up words all the time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. There's just so much that I don't know. It's hard to say what will stick with them, but then that's true with music and anything else. I think that the difference with shows now as compared to last century is that, like you were talking about before, you didn't have serialized shows as much, except for soap operas, because you couldn't go back and watch the previous episode. So if you missed it, you missed it. And now shows are made to keep their attention by having a cliffhanger every single episode.
Mhm.
And you need to continue watching and you have to start from the beginning. And so I don't know. I don't know how that's going to be for them, but again, they have so many other outlets also that maybe TV's not as important to them as it was to us.
I think that's a great conclusion because when I really think about like even say like Lost, like I remember when Lost was out and I watched Lost or whatever, I could tell you more about what I remember from like Highway to Heaven or whatever than I could tell you about Lost because there was something about that. Everything was in digestible chunks,
Yes.
but there's also that concept, like you said, that wasn't a gazillion shows for us to watch.
Mhm. And my daughter prefers watching like reruns of Hannah Montana and old Disney shows to new shows because I think just because you have that little snippet, that bite of a half hour show,
Hmm.
and you don't have to go through all of that. I think TV before shows like Twin Peaks was not as, there wasn't as much of a commitment to stick with that show because you weren't following a storyline. And now these shows need a commitment, which is why I like the reboots. And, I like when we get back to our roots of sitcoms.
Hmm.
That's my favorite.
I love that, and I also do love some of the more modernized, like the PI shows or like the cop shows that, especially the ones that were kind of quirky, that weren't super serious. Like I wasn't allowed to watch Hill Street Blues or anything like that though, but I was allowed to watch Simon and Simon.
Ah, My favorite.
That is in my top five shows of that generation. If not, I mean, that show was like banger after banger. I don't think I ever remembered there being a bad episode of that show.
And when you see an episode of a show from back then and you remember every minute of the show, like because it stuck with you, even if you only saw it once, that is the best feeling. Like, I remember what happens in this because it was so important to me then. And I hope that TV starts to get back to that. I hope that they start to realize that we don't want to be committed to this show. We just want entertainment. And maybe we have some fatigue from trying to keep tabs on Lost and all that. I don't know.
And I think one other thing I do remember about shows from back then was that there were a lot of shows that were character based, like in the sense that there was very memorable characters, and even more so sometimes than who played them. It was the characters that you would remember. And I feel like I do see that a little more late, like Only Murders in the Building, things like that, where that to me is kind of like this old school, like you got three characters and you remember their names and you know who they are and you can vividly see them. And I'm like, that's probably one of the few shows that I've watched in the past decade, maybe or so, where I feel like character based, like they stick with me. And I love that because I'm like, that's such an old school mentality of storytelling.
Yeah, I think you've totally pinpointed why I love that show because it's fun and it's lighthearted, but also there's not a lot to keep track of. Like, I can't keep track of all the people on The Walking Dead, but I can keep track of Only Murders in the Building.
I had to stop that show like halfway through the second season because at some point I was like, how long can they just not know how to kill zombies at this point? I'm like, or how are they even not dead? Yeah, exactly.
Here's the thing is my husband, he hates sitcoms. I love sitcoms. He likes gore and horror and stuff like that, which I don't like. So we watched all of The Walking Dead for like 8 seasons. And I just kept hoping it's going to turn into a sitcom at some point. Like, they're going to kill all the zombies and they're going to move into a little community and everyone's going to be happy and they're going to be farmers. And then we're going to have, like, crazy situations that are happening with the neighbors. That's what I was hoping for, and it never happened. So,
Or if you really want to get 80s on it, they could make friends with a zombie couple who has a kid and then just find out that they're like they could teach them to not eat and then they could just like be neighbors in like a duplex or something like
yeah. I think that's a Drew Barrymore show, actually.
we should get in on this. Like we should start writing some things.
So many ideas for shows. So many ideas for shows.
That's amazing. Well, to close out real quick, I'm gonna ask you this. What would you say your top five shows are from memory? But then what are the top five shows that you've covered that you did not like think you liked so much back in the day?
Okay. So my top 5 shows of all time.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So The Monkees is number one because I'm a gigantic Monkees fan.
We bonded on that. I remember that. Yes.
We did. We did. Simon and Simon. Full House. I'm huge for Full House. And I was secretly dating John Stamos for most of my life.
All of you girls were dating John Stamos at that point.
He is my secret boyfriend. Let's see. What else? Gosh, I don't know. I've recently. Okay, so your second question, that was only three. I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's a good three.
I can't pull the other ones up off the top of my head, but I will later after this conversation, and then I will have a conversation with myself later on.
Or
So the
message me
shows,
and let me know because now I'm going to be like, what were those? I
okay.
want to know what
Oh,
those
what
other
were
shows
they?
were.
Because I have ADHD too. So shows that I discovered by doing the podcast, my favorite is Living Single with Queen Latifah. Absolutely love that show, and that's now my comfort show that I watch every time I don't have anything else to do. Let's see, another one that I was surprised by. Gosh, now I'm trying to recall the shows, but I would say Living Single is the number one that I was excited to discover. And Dallas. No, Dallas. Sorry to interrupt you. My bestie, Natalie, my co host, made me watch all seasons of Dallas, and we recapped all of them on the podcast individually. And that took us a couple years. Yeah.
So do you remember who shot JR?
Oh, of course I do. And I really thought that that was a bigger deal, like in the show itself, than it turned out to be, because it was like the end of an episode, who shot JR, and then like 2 weeks later, they're like, oh, it was this person. Oh, okay.
That was it.
Okay, well, they wouldn't do that now. They wouldn't just tell you in the next episode. They would stretch it out for an entire season.
Right. No, you waited until like a week, 2 weeks later, and then
Yeah,
you found out who it was because they needed to move on to the next storyline, you know?
exactly. Yeah, that was I really didn't expect to like Dallas, and I was very resistant, but I would watch it again.
And finally, I guess relating to your kids,
Mhm.
who obviously you said are teenagers now, is there anything that you feel like that when you've shared with them that they have taken and said like, wow, that's really cool. Like I would like to maybe try to adopt into this and like check this out.
Of course, I hoped it was Be the Monkeys, but it has never been. But
Which
my
is a
dad felt,
travesty, by the
I
way.
know, my dad felt the same way about the Beatles, so it's only fair. um, but my daughter and I watched the Full House reboot together. We watched Fuller House, and she loved it. And so then we went back and watched the whole Full House series, and she loved it. And that made me very happy because it's one of my favorite shows. And that, I think, was what really got her onto watching like Hannah Montana and stuff like that, because she now really likes sitcoms like I do. So, but she won't watch them with me. She has to watch them on her own.
What what is the thing with the reluctance of kids wanting to do things with like I mean I get it. We didn't love to do everything with our parents and everything, but like you
Yeah,
said, like we were if we were tied to one television, like you didn't have and your other option was to go into your room, you know?
exactly.
And if you heard you right, if you heard everyone laughing in the living room, you were like, "Oh man, I want to go see what they're laughing at."
We had watched How I Met Your Mother together.
Hmm.
And so then a couple weeks ago, I had been trying to get her to watch a certain show that we mentioned before. And so a couple weeks ago, she was like, Mom, come here quick. She was watching TV in the living room. She said, I'm watching this show in Spanish, and Marshall from How I Met Your Mother is on this show, because she has been learning Spanish. So she watches
Hmm.
Spanish shows. Well, I get down there, she's watching an overdub. It's not in Spanish, it's an overdub in Spanish. I said, baby, that's Freaks and Geeks. That's the show I've been trying to get you to watch for months. I said, do you want to watch Freaks and Geeks in English? No. She immediately turned off the TV. She didn't watch another minute. She won't watch Freaks and Geeks. I was like, oh my God.
Because the minute you said something about it being relatable to you, she was like, "Oh my God, I've fallen into old
Oh my
person
God.
territory."
She was so mad.
I was thinking about some of the throwback shows, how like, like we had the Wonder Years, right? That was talking more about like the 60s and stuff. And then all of a sudden, like we had what, like the Goldbergs, which I was like, oh my God, that was the Wonder Years, like for us. And then this is like for like my niece and nephews to watch. And I specifically remember one of my wife's nephews going, Big Don, was it really like that? Like, did you do this stuff? And I was like, I mean, I'm not gonna tell you everything, but yeah, I mean, that was kind of us for the most part. And he was just like, that's so weird to me.
Is it? Is it?
He was like, did you guys really get excited to get calculators for Christmas? And I was like, oh my
Oh.
God, it was amazing.
I mean, if you didn't have one and it was nice, then yeah.
Oh my God, you get a TI-82 and you were like, oh my gosh, this is great. And of course, the only thing we knew how to do is to spell cuss words and
Yeah.
letters and then flip it upside down.
And boobs.
Boobs, hell, boobless, all that stuff.
Uh,
But Rebecca, it's so cool talking to you. I appreciate it.
I fully appreciate you inviting me on your podcast. This is awesome.
And so they can check you out at TV Tangents on TikTok, and then the TV Tangents podcast, which is on all the streaming platforms like Spotify, Apple Music.
Look for it all over. We're also on Podbean. That's where our main page is. You can find it all over and listen and say hi.
And go listen to the V episodes. Trust me, that is gold. I just absolutely love that one. So
Thank you.
Rebecca, thank you so much for doing this, and you're a sweetheart. I love talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Love talking to you.